My mom got involved with a jerk who was determined to kick me out of the house. He didn't even bother to ask me before he rented out my room. All of this happened when I was in college, my mom married a jerk who didn't even consult me before renting out my room. Now, years later, they're in serious trouble and are pleading with me to help them avoid prison. I'm 25 now, and I've never gotten along with my stepdad Rick, who's 52. He married my mom, who's 47, when I was 15, after a very short dating period. And even though it's been a decade, I still think he's the person I dislike the most. My parents divorced when I was about 4 or 5, so I mostly grew up with my mom, who had full custody of me initially. My dad, who's 50 and an architect, would visit on weekends. When I was around 7, the custody arrangement changed so that I split my time between both parents, spending half the month with each. My mom had been a stay-at-home mom most of her life, so I was pretty close to her growing up. At 16, my dad got a fantastic job offer that required him to move out of state. It was a tough decision for him because it meant he wouldn't see me as often. By that time, my mom had already married Rick, who was terrible to live with. I frequently complained about Rick to my dad, so he knew what was going on at my mom's place. He asked if I wanted to move with him, but I refused because I didn't want to leave my mom behind. Even though my dad almost turned down the job for my sake, I encouraged him to take it because it was a great opportunity for him. So he moved away and we kept in touch through video calls and saw each other during holidays. But I still missed him a lot. Living with Rick was miserable. He was a bully who went out of his way to belittle me whenever he could. He hadn't acted this way while he was just dating my mom, though he was awkward around me. But after they got married, he changed completely, probably because he wanted me out of their lives. He made things as uncomfortable as possible for me, but I wasn't going to leave my mom alone with him. I tried to keep my head down and ignore him, though sometimes I couldn't help but argue with him. But I stayed put. Rick wasn't just awful to me, he treated my mom poorly too. He'd push her around like she was nothing, and she let him walk all over her. I tried convincing her to leave him multiple times, but she always defended him, saying he was a good man and that I didn't know everything about him. I never believed her and thought he was exactly as terrible as he seemed. He was also insanely jealous of my dad. He wouldn't let my mom keep anything from her past with my father, telling her to destroy it all. She didn't. Instead, she stashed everything in the attic. Rick's insecurity was obvious, especially when my dad visited for holidays or my birthday and brought expensive gifts. I'd flaunt them around just to annoy Rick and highlight the difference in their earnings, since Rick worked as a construction manager and didn't make nearly as much as my dad. I enjoyed rubbing it in his face, never thinking that someday he might turn that against me. So I spent a few years at home with Rick, trying my best to get by. I had to endure living with Rick for my mom's sake, but when it was finally time for me to head off to college, I couldn't wait. I was excited because it meant I'd only have to come home for the holidays and wouldn't have to deal with Rick constantly being around. I felt relieved, but I was also worried about what my mom would go through without me there. Still, I couldn't abandon my plans for college. It was something I had to do. I decided to come back home every other weekend to check on my mom, but I kept this plan a secret to surprise her. On the day I left for college, my mom got very emotional, and we had a tearful farewell. Meanwhile, Rick couldn't stop grinning and even gave me some cash as a parting gift. It was clear he was thrilled to finally get rid of me. My dad was covering my college expenses, so I wasn't stressed about money and left without much worry. At first, I visited home on alternate weekends, just like I planned, to see how my mom was doing. But after a while, my mom asked me not to visit unless it was for holidays because Rick got annoyed whenever I was around. Then, she told me something that really hurt, both then and even now. She said that Rick would usually be in a bad mood when I was there, which made him treat her poorly as well. However, when I wasn't around, he acted like a pleasant and reasonable person, so she asked me to cut down on my visits, implying that things were better without me. That crushed me, and I felt really down for a while. I decided not to go back home until Christmas at the very least. I even spent Thanksgiving break in a hotel instead of going home since it was a short break. I told my dad about the situation, and he was furious. But I asked him not to bring it up with my mom because if I was causing problems for her, then I'd rather stay away. Our conversations became strained and eventually stopped altogether. So when I finally went home for Christmas, I wasn't particularly excited. I thought my mom would be happy to see me, but she seemed shocked instead. Before we could talk, a guy I didn't recognize walked out of the door, thanked my mom for lunch, and left. Confused, I asked my mom who he was. She explained that Rick had rented out the first floor of our two-story house, which had always been my space. That meant my room was gone. She let me in and said she could explain, but asked me to be patient. I was already upset, and my anger grew when I saw Rick lounging on the couch with a drink in his hand. He made a face when he saw me, and I couldn't hold back. I confronted him about the room, and he casually told me that since I was an adult and didn't live there anymore, he decided to rent it out for some extra money. I called him an idiot and asked where he thought I would stay when I came back. He smirked and said that since my dad was well off, he was sure my dad would arrange something for me, so there was no need to get worked up. I was so furious that I couldn't even respond to him. I turned to my mom and asked if she was okay with this. She just hung her head and said nothing, which was the final straw for me. I was ready to fight Rick for my room back, but I realized it wasn't worth it. I didn't want to waste my energy. I grabbed my stuff and left the house, expecting my mom to follow me, but she didn't. As I waited for a cab, I could hear them arguing inside. While I couldn't make out the words, my mom sounded angry, which was a small relief because at least she was expressing something. But after that day, I decided I would never go back. I had tried for years to support my mom, and if she couldn't appreciate that, it was her loss. That day was the last time I saw either my mother or Rick. Once I got into the cab, I never looked back. I was completely done with my mom after that incident. I talked to my dad about everything that happened, and he told me that from then on, I could always visit him whenever I needed a place to go. So that's what I did. I spent every holiday with him. After I graduated, I moved in with my dad, who helped me land my first internship and eventually my first job. I still live with him, and he's pretty much my only family now. I stopped talking to my grandparents around the same time I cut ties with my mom, but that wasn't difficult since we were never close. My dad's parents had passed away when I was very young, so I never got to know them. Now it's just me and my dad, and we've come to terms with it. Honestly, we're quite happy living together. He's my best friend, and I couldn't have asked for a better father. Everything was going great until last week when, out of the blue, my mom contacted me after almost 7 years of silence. She reached out on Facebook, saying it was an emergency and she desperately needed my help. She insisted that I visit her as soon as possible because it wasn't something she could explain online. I responded, telling her I didn't live in the same city anymore and couldn't visit. She then suggested I call her, giving me her number, but I told her I wasn't interested in anything she had to say and left it at that. She didn't give up, though. She kept texting me over the next few days, but I still didn't respond. Finally, she sent a message explaining the situation. Apparently, she and Rick had taken out a huge personal loan of about $80,000 from Rick's boss, claiming they needed it to pay for my tuition. Now, after all these years, the boss was demanding repayment. They couldn't afford to pay it back, so they wanted me to pretend to be sick or something to gain sympathy and avoid being sued since they had signed paperwork agreeing to repay the loan with interest. The whole plan was insane, and I wanted no part in it. Even if I had been on good terms with my mom and Rick, I would never have agreed to such a scheme. I told her exactly that. She didn't respond for a couple of days, but then, a few days ago, she texted me again, saying she was in my city and needed to see me. I was shocked she'd go to such lengths, but I guess it made sense since they were in big trouble and counting on me to bail them out. I told her I wouldn't meet her because I wanted nothing to do with this shady and dangerous situation. I suggested they offer to pay back the loan in installments and hope Rick's boss would accept it. She then messaged back, saying she understood if I didn't want to help with their plan, but pleaded to see me one last time since she had come all this way. I knew she was bluffing, but I agreed to meet her for lunch partly because I missed her. We finally met yesterday, and it was emotional at first. But she quickly ruined the moment by bringing up the loan and her plan within half an hour. I was so frustrated that I didn't even bother responding. I just got up and left without saying a word. She called after me, but I ignored her, hurried to my car, and drove home as fast as I could. Looking back, I regret even giving it a chance. It was my fault for agreeing to meet her, knowing she was probably bluffing. But at this point, I don't think there's anything more I need to feel bad about. My dad and I both feel there's nothing more to worry about regarding my mom, but she clearly doesn't see it that way. Last night, she sent me a long video, very late, where it was obvious she was drunk and crying. In the video, she said she expected me to help her out, claiming I'd been her shield throughout my childhood. She acknowledged that she'd made mistakes but was disappointed in me for seeking revenge instead of being the bigger person, especially with so much at stake. She was extremely emotional, and her words were hard to understand between the crying and slurred speech, but it was clear she was very upset with me. She kept saying she thought she could always rely on me, but I'd let her down, and she was deeply disappointed. By the end, she was sobbing uncontrollably, and I felt a wave of disgust wash over me after watching it. Despite everything, I do love my mom, and seeing her like this is unbearable. I can't stand the thought of her possibly going to prison if she can't repay that money or if I don't buy her more time. She seemed to lose her way after marrying Rick, but before that, she had been a loving and caring mother. This feels like my one chance to repay her for all she did for me. However, I also know I shouldn't risk my own well-being by getting involved in this mess. For one, she hasn't even told me what exactly they used the loan for. I can't step in without knowing all the facts. Moreover, the plan is not foolproof and could backfire badly if they don't think it through. Rick's boss isn't dumb. He might see right through their ruse, and that could be very dangerous for them. I genuinely want to help my mom, but I can't do it at the cost of my own reputation. I'm torn because it feels selfish, but my common sense tells me to stay out of it. I don't want my mom to end up in prison, but I don't know what to do. Am I wrong for not wanting to help her dodge legal trouble over a loan she can't repay? Update 1. I made the tough decision to block my mom, so she can't contact me anymore. It was hard, but I needed to do it, and now I feel somewhat relieved. I talked to my dad about the video and everything, and he said it was good I didn't fall for it, because she was clearly trying to manipulate me emotionally. She knew how much I valued her, and was banking on that to get me to help her. Some of you in the comments mentioned that I might have mommy issues, and while it's hard to admit, that might be true. Reddit can't solve that, but therapy can. So I'm looking into finding a therapist because I realize this isn't healthy for me. I'd never considered therapy before, but it's time. I did some digging and found out more about Rick's boss, and I'm so glad I didn't agree to help my mom. It would have weighed heavily on my conscience. It wasn't hard to figure out. I just had to check Rick's social media. He had a lot of photos with coworkers, and the oldest guy there, who clearly looked like the boss, was easy to spot. I found his account and realized why Rick and my mom might have thought their plan could work. His boss had lost a daughter to cancer a couple of years ago, and they probably wanted me to pretend to be sick to exploit his empathy and delay repayment. The plan wasn't just foolish. It was insensitive and cruel, preying on a tragedy that had deeply affected him. Once I realized that, blocking my mom became a no-brainer. I don't know whose idea it was, but whoever thought it up is a terrible person, and anyone who agreed is just as bad. I'm just relieved I didn't fall for my mom's manipulation. I'm beginning to see how cunning she can be. I thought I needed to protect her, but it turns out I was the one who needed protection, and she failed miserably at that. It's safe to say that I don't feel guilty anymore, especially after realizing what they planned to do and how they wanted to use me to achieve their disgusting scheme. They deserve whatever consequences come their way. Update 2. Since my mom couldn't reach me, she contacted my dad instead, which was surprising given they hadn't spoken in years, maybe even longer than that. She repeated much of what she had told me, trying to get him to sympathize with her and convince me to play along with their plan. But my dad made it clear that I wasn't interested, reminding her that I'm a grown man and can't be forced into something I don't want to do. She tried to yell at him, claiming he was being unfair and not understanding her desperation. It was as if she thought this situation was somehow our fault. But my dad stood firm. He even warned her that if she kept bothering us, he'd take action, possibly by informing her husband's boss about what she was trying to pull to avoid repaying the money. Surprisingly, this didn't faze her. She seemed to believe we wouldn't go that far. She did, however, ask him to pass along a message to me. She wanted me to know they hadn't borrowed the money for anything shady or frivolous. They were planning to start their own business, with my mom trying to return to work after a long break. Unfortunately, they got scammed and couldn't invest the money, which led to their current trouble. They didn't want to involve banks because they wouldn't be as lenient as Rick's boss, and they couldn't tell him the real reason for the loan. fearing a conflict of interest. So they lied and now found themselves in a mess they couldn't escape without my help. But I made it clear that I didn't care. They had been nothing but cruel to me, and I wasn't going to be stupid enough to get involved just to save them. I didn't like them, didn't respect them, and certainly didn't owe them anything, contrary to what my mom tried to make me believe. I was done. She wasn't my family anymore, and she needed to understand that she couldn't count on me. She couldn't, and she shouldn't be delusional about it. Update 3. I finally heard back from my mom after almost 3 months of complete silence. She informed me that they were going to try to repay the loan and no longer needed my help. Of course, she wasn't nice about it. She was pretty rude and sarcastically thanked me for nothing in her message. She used a different number since I had blocked her previous one, but I guess this was important enough for her to get a new number. She continued to express her disappointment in me, stating she never wanted to see me again. I'm fine with that because honestly, why would she want to see me after all that's happened? She also mentioned that she and Rick had sold their house and moved into a smaller apartment, somehow implying it was my fault. I don't understand how she could twist it that way, but at this point, nothing surprises me. She always finds a way to blame me for everything that goes wrong in her life. The bottom line is that I'm finally done with her, and we don't need to talk anymore. She hates me, and I hate her. End of story.